On June 24, 2026, Germany's Ministry of Defense officially canceled the F-126 frigate program, which includes 6 advanced anti-submarine warships, over 10 billion euros on paper, and the single largest surface combatant project in post-war German naval history. 2,300,000,000 euros already spent, a partially built hull sitting in a shipyard in Wolgast with an uncertain future, and a defense minister who looked at a program 6 years in the making and said, "We're done." Rheinmetall's stock dropped double digits within hours of this announcement, and this isn't just a German story. It's a preview that tells you a lot more about the state of European defense procurement than the headline lets on. Let's get into it. Back in 2020, Germany awarded a contract to the Dutch shipbuilder Damen Sheldon Naval Shipbuilding to build 6 F-126 class frigates, over 10,000-ton ships, roughly 166 meters long, designed to be among the largest frigates in the world, bigger than a lot of nations' destroyers, frankly. The mission set was ambitious, primarily anti-submarine warfare, replacing the aging F-123 Brandenburg-class frigates, but built with a modular design that could be reconfigured for different roles over the ship's service life. The plan was for all 6 to be in the water by 2033, at a program cost of around 10 billion euros. The keel for the lead ship, to be named Niedersachsen, was laid in Wolgast back in June 2024. On paper, this looked like a serious, forward-leaning investment in German naval power, at a moment when NATO's Baltic and North Atlantic anti-submarine posture has never mattered more. And then it started to slip. Here's where I want to slow down, because this is the part of the story that a lot of channels are going to gloss over in favor of the "Germany cancels warships" headline. The actual collapse of this program took years, and it followed a pattern that should look uncomfortably familiar to anyone who follows defense acquisition on either side of the Atlantic. Damen, the original prime contractor, notified Berlin that it could not deliver the ships within the agreed schedule or budget. The contract had called for the first ship to achieve initial operational capability by mid-2028. That timeline became increasingly unrealistic. So Germany did what a lot of governments do when a prime contractor falters. It started looking for an exit ramp. Since 2025, the Ministry of Defense had been exploring whether to transfer the general contractor role away from Damen and over to Naval Vessels Lürssen, a shipbuilding group that notably had recently been acquired by Rheinmetall for something in the neighborhood of 1.5 billion euros. This was Rheinmetall's big bet on becoming a vertically integrated naval prime, not just a supplier of turrets and munitions, but a company that could deliver complete armed warships. By this past spring, Rheinmetall and NVL had put together an offer to take over the F-126 program for around 12.8 billion euros to complete all 6 ships. That deal was reportedly finalized and headed to the Bundestag's Budget Committee, the Haushaltsausschuss, ahead of the summer recess. Then the ministry did its own review, and the number they came back with wasn't 12.8 billion. It was closer to 15.2 billion euros, just for the new contract with NVL. And when you layered in the money already sunk into the Damen contract, plus necessary supply and support agreements that would still need to be honored, the total financial requirement for finishing all 6 F-126 frigates climbed past 18 billion euros. That's nearly double the original 10 billion euro estimate, for ships that, under the new timeline, wouldn't have started arriving until 2032, 4 years later than originally planned. And there was one more wrinkle that I think is genuinely important and gets buried in a lot of the coverage. Switching prime contractors would have required Berlin to contractually waive any potential damage claims against Damen, the original contractor, as part of the transition. The ministry said that condition ran contrary to its understanding of responsible use of public funds. In plain English, Germany would have had to give up its legal right to go after Damen for the delays, as the price of moving on to a new contractor. That's a real sticking point for any government trying to be seen as a responsible steward of taxpayer money, and it appears to have been one of the final straws. So on June 24th, the ministry pulled the plug, a total cancellation. Here's the part that I think is actually the most interesting piece of this whole story, and it's the part a scrolling headline doesn't capture. Germany didn't just cancel a program and leave a hole in its fleet planning. It pivoted almost immediately to a very different kind of ship. Instead of 6 large, bespoke 10,550-ton frigates, Germany is now planning to procure up to 8 MEKO A200 DEU frigates from ThyssenKrupp Marine Systems. These are roughly 4,000 to 4,200 tons, about a third of the F-126's displacement, and around 120 meters long. This isn't a clean sheet design. The MECO A200 family is an existing, in-service design already operated by navies including Algeria, Egypt, and South Africa. Germany is essentially buying a proven, exportable platform off the shelf, rather than developing a bespoke mega frigate from scratch. The financials here are worth breaking down clearly, because they explain a lot about German thinking. The first 4 MECO A200 DEU frigates are expected to cost around 6.3 billion euros, subject to approval from the budget committee. There's an option for 4 more, which Berlin can exercise by the end of 2026, priced at roughly 5.3 billion euros. Add those together, and you get a combined potential cost of about 11.6 billion euros for 8 ships, compared to over 18 billion for 6 of the original F-126s. The German Navy's top uniformed officer, Vice Admiral Jan Christian Koch, has formally signed off on the idea that the MECO A200 DEU can fulfill Germany's core anti-submarine warfare mission and meet its NATO commitments. That endorsement matters. It tells you this isn't purely a cost-cutting retreat dressed up as strategy. The Navy's own leadership is on record saying this smaller ship gets the essential job done. There's also a continuity thread worth mentioning. Both the new MECO frigates and the F-123 frigates currently being refitted with anti-submarine upgrades will apparently use the same Atlas electronic towed sonar array that was originally selected for the F-126. So while the hull and a lot of the systems are changing, Germany is trying to preserve at least some commonality in undersea sensing across its surface fleet. One trade-off analysts are watching closely. To hit this compressed delivery timeline, key sensor and combat management systems for the MECO A200 are expected to be drawn from the same TKMS package offered to Australia, meaning radars and the combat management system would reportedly come from Sweden rather than from traditional German suppliers like Hensoldt and Thales. That's a meaningful shift in industrial participation, even if the hulls are still built in Germany. The first MECO A200 is expected around the end of 2029, with follow-on ships reportedly arriving roughly every 9 months after that, a delivery cadence that, on paper, is faster and more predictable than what the F-126 program had been managing to produce. Now let's talk fallout, because markets reacted almost instantly, and that tells you something about how this decision is being read in the defense industrial base. Rheinmetall shares fell sharply on the news. Reports put the drop anywhere from roughly 13 to 20%, depending on the point in the trading day you're looking at. That's a significant single-day move for a company of Rheinmetall's size, and it makes sense once you understand what was actually at stake for them. Rheinmetall's naval ambitions weren't a side project. The company's roughly 1.5 billion euro acquisition of NVL was a strategic bet on becoming a true, vertically integrated naval prime contractor, not just supplying components, but building and arming complete warships. The F-126 handover was supposed to be the anchor contract for that entire strategy, part of a push to scale Rheinmetall's naval revenue towards something like 5 billion euros by 2030. Losing that anchor is a real setback for that ambition, not just a missed contract. On the other side of the ledger, TKMS shares rose, reportedly around 10%, after being confirmed as the supplier for the new MECO order. For a company that builds hulls but doesn't traditionally arm them the way Rheinmetall was positioning to do, this is a significant vote of confidence from Berlin. Politically, the reaction inside Germany has been notably unified. Bastian Ernst, the naval affairs spokesperson for the CDU-CSU parliamentary group, publicly welcomed the pivot, framing the F-126 as an overambitious jack-of-all-trades design whose schedule had become impossible to reconcile with Germany's NATO commitments. That's a striking admission from a governing coalition-aligned voice, essentially conceding that the original program tried to do too much and that a simpler, faster, more exportable design is the more responsible path forward given Germany's alliance obligations. It's also worth noting the broader political backdrop. German press has pointed out that the F-126 was originally launched under Ursula von der Leyen during her time as defense minister, adding a bit of historical irony to a story that's ultimately about a program failing to survive contact with reality. Okay, zoom out with me for a second, because this is where I think the real value of this story lives. This is not the first time in the last few years we've watched a NATO Navy walk back an ambitious, bespoke shipbuilding program in favor of something smaller, more modular, and faster to field. And it won't be the last. What the F-126 saga demonstrates, in very concrete euro figures, is the widening gap between what defense ministries want to build and what shipyards can actually deliver on time and on budget, especially for complex, first-of-class combatants with ambitious modular requirements. There's a real lesson here about program risk. The F-126 wasn't cancelled because anti-submarine warfare stopped mattering. If anything, undersea competition in the North Atlantic and Baltic has only intensified. It was cancelled because the gap between contracted cost and actual cost to complete grew so wide, and the schedule slipped so far that continuing became harder to justify than restarting with a smaller, proven design. Nearly doubling from 10 billion to 18 billion euros, with delivery slipping years past the original target, that's the kind of number that forces a government's hand, regardless of the underlying strategic need. For NATO more broadly, the open questions are the ones worth watching going forward. Will Germany actually exercise that 4-ship MECO option before the end of 2026? Will the 2029 delivery date for the first MECO A200 hold, given that ambitious naval timelines have a well-documented habit of slipping? And what happens to that partially built F-126 hull sitting in Wolgast? Does it get repurposed, scrapped, or quietly forgotten? None of that has been resolved yet. There's also a fleet in being question that shouldn't get lost here. Germany still has an anti-submarine warfare gap to manage in the near term, while all of this plays out, which is part of why the 3 F-123 Brandenburg-class frigates are being refitted with new towed sonar systems, aiming for completion around 2029, to bridge the capability gap until the new MECO frigates start arriving. So where does that leave us? Germany just tore up its most ambitious naval shipbuilding plan in 3/4 of a century, ate a couple billion euros in sunk costs, and pivoted to a smaller, cheaper, faster-to-build frigate that its own navy says can still do the job. That's either a case study in disciplined program management or a cautionary tale about how ambitious European defense projects keep running into the same wall, depending on which analyst you ask. And honestly, there's a reasonable case for both readings. What's clear is that this is a story worth tracking for the next 18 months, not just this week. The Budget Committee vote on that 4-ship option, the 2029 delivery target, and the fate of that half-built hull in Wolgast are all going to tell us whether Germany actually learned something from the F-126, or whether the MECO program just hasn't hit its own wall yet.